Dr. Daley, great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you as well.
So you're in your first year teaching here at Calvin Seminary. So you're very new to most of our audience, most of our alumni and community probably don't know you as well. So tell me about your life pre-CTS, school, work, family. What brought you here?
To make a probably quite long story as short as I can, I'll give you maybe the flashcard version, but I grew up in Northern California. Incredible household, wonderful parents. But like a lot of people, even in really wonderful households, I hit age of about 19 and was aimless and had no idea what to do with myself. And I had some friends and family that had moved into Reno, Nevada, of all places, and had joined what for Reno was a quite large church. Reno is one of the most unchurched places in the United States. But this one ministry that was happening there was quite successful and doing really well, but they were not doing quite so well with college students and young adults. So they started a ministry particularly to reach that age group. And because I was 19 and had no ambition or vision for my life, a lot of them just kept asking me to move there and help them with this thing, get it off the ground. So I did. And when I got there, the ministry took off. While I was doing that, I started a bachelor's in Bible and Theology from Multnomah University, which is actually in Portland, Oregon, but I did a lot of distance learning and traveled up to Portland for coursework and whatnot. And a lot happened in 13 years there. Met my wife, got married, had all three of our kids in Reno, the last one just a year before we ended up leaving there. And then I ended up eventually getting hired full-time to work there at that church. I was a pastor there for 8 years. But while I was doing that, in the ministry side of things and academic side of things at Multnomah University, it was constantly said to me that I should go and do grad school and train pastors as opposed to being one. And so after resisting that for an awful long time, I made the decision, my wife and I did, to do that. So we moved to Scotland, where I did 2 master's degrees at the University of Edinburgh. The first was taught courses, just basic biblical studies degree, and the second one was a research degree in New Testament language, literature, theology. And then we went to Ireland, where I did my doctorate at Trinity College Dublin, University of Dublin. Spent 4 years there, loving every minute of it, traveling the country extensively. And then after that, I went and did a fellowship in Belgium for 4 years at a small university city called Leuven, which is about 15 minutes outside of Brussels. There's a major university there called Katholieke Universiteit of Leuven, or KU Leuven for people who don't want to mess with that tongue twister. And I did a fellowship there for a few years, working on a book that I'm still working on, but it's almost finished. So I'm sure we'll get to that. That's the next project down the line. But that's the flashcard version. I'm married, have 3 wonderful children, ages 19, 17, and almost 12. The first 2 are boys, and then the youngest is a girl. And I moved here after spending 10 whole years. If you can tell from that sort of timeline, my family and I spent 10 years in Europe. But needed to settle down after moving around to 3 different countries over 10 years. Of course, we loved that, right? I mean, we traveled Europe extensively and just had an incredible experience there. And I got to meet lots of different biblical scholars from around the world and travel art museums and grew this eclectic list of interests over time. But, at some point, my wife said, all right, it's time probably for us to settle down. So I saw that Calvin was hiring. Really appreciate the pedigree of the academics here, applied and got it. So joined here at the start of this last school year.
It's fantastic. So since joining our community here at Calvin Seminary, and I know you're still new, but what have been some of your favorite aspects of your work, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom?
Inside the classroom, I appreciate the fact that, at least my experience so far has been this, and I assume that that's going to continue, is that I think that professors here are given quite a bit of room, a lot of space to bring their own giftings, experiences, and education into the classroom, to work on the lectures that extend from our own research, to be able to share with students the things that we have interest in, right? So it's not like I was given this sort of strict set of parameters and told to squeeze lectures into those parameters. I was just told to be me. And to me, that's the best way for me to help students, is to sort of teach teach in a way that's an extension of myself. There's this old theologian, Adolf Schlatter, who talked about this idea that, when we read the Bible, interpret the Bible, that one thing we should never do is to annihilate the self, right? And I've never been asked to annihilate myself in the process of teaching. I get to be who I am. So in the classroom, I love that. Outside of the classroom, it's just being with students. That's my favorite part of being a professor, is being with students, trying to take advantage of most of the opportunities that the seminary provides to do that. So we have things like public reading of scripture, and we have chapel, and I attend both of those almost all the time. Of course, I have to miss every once in a while, but I attend both of them as often as I can. I like to be in the building, so I'm here almost every day with my door open. I'm one of those few people that doesn't really mind getting interrupted, even randomly. Like if somebody comes by outside of office hours, I'm fine with that, because the thing that they're interrupting me with is probably more important than the thing I'm already doing. And so, I think that's my favorite part, is just being around the students and sort of learning about their rhythms and their lives and why they're here and what are their biblical and theological interests or ministry interests or whatever, and trying to help them along their path, and particularly being able to share my path as a way to help them figure out their own, I think is really interesting. I would say that's probably the main thing in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I know that our entire community has loved having you here, and just having that open door, having your knowledge, your experience, your willingness to share about your experiences in Europe. And so moving into your book, Ideal Disciples, this is not your first one with Baylor Press, not your first thing you've published. So in 2021, you published God's Will and Testament. Yeah. How did that book, if at all, kind of springboard Ideal Disciples?
Well, almost entirely so. I mean, even to the degree that I've been calling the new book almost a loose sequel to the first one. The first book was on sort of a biblical theology of the concept of inheritance. So it's a really long book. It's almost 400 pages, and it has a huge introductory section on the Gospel of Matthew to sort of clear ground and set the stage for the discussion that I want to have. The second section then is on Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, inheritance in the Old Testament, kind of what various texts have to say about theological inheritance. And I say theological inheritance because in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, it's both. Some of the inheritances are just, actual fathers passing down stuff to their kids. But a lot of the time it's talking about God as a father passing down something quite more significant than an estate that belongs to a family. So I try to clear the weeds on sort of the distinctions there and lay that out. And I get into inheritance, Second Temple period, apocryphal literature, pseudepigraphal literature. And then all of that, really, the end game was Matthew for me. So I have a really long discussion on inheritance in Matthew. In that discussion, in that first book, I have a really long section on inheritance in one beatitude in particular, which is Matthew 5:5. And so I try to clear ground by talking about what a beatitude even is. And I spend a lot of time on that in the first book. And then I only provide an exegesis of the one. Mm-hmm. Well, 1.5, because I do about a half exegesis on Matthew 5:3 for various reasons. But mostly just focus on the one beatitude. And then I move on to other things, other texts in Matthew. And ever since then, I had just had several people who had said to me, I would love to see the way in which you're tackling Beatitudes in a more focused expression on the Beatitudes in particular, where you then do an exegesis of all of the other Beatitudes that you ignored in the first book. So this one really is kind of a sequel in the sense that I reworked and rewrote most of the material on the Beatitudes from that first one, but I still brought a lot of that over as sort of the introduction then to the new one. And I use that as a way to set the stage for doing that exegesis of all of the other Beatitudes that I ignored in the first book. So they really are, you would never have to read the first one to read the second. So that's why I would say that I might loosely call it a sequel, because to be a true sequel, you'd probably have to read one to read the other. Mm-hmm. And in this case, you don't, because all of the important material from the first one is in fact carried over into the second one in the introductory section. And then I move on to whole new stuff that's not in the first one at all and only moderately relevant to the first one. So, yeah, the first one was the springboard for the second, but they're not dependent upon each other in any way. They typically are making completely separate arguments.
Speaking of the introduction of Ideal Disciples, which I enjoyed the whole book, but I just thought it set a really great framework for how you approach the Beatitudes. But you write in your introduction, We are enriched by the insights of others who engage with the text differently from ourselves. So how did your experiences living abroad in Scotland, Ireland, and Belgium give you a different perspective on Matthew's Beatitudes? And maybe can you think of an example where someone you interacted with from a context different than your own drew on their experience to help you understand Matthew's Beatitudes in a new way?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I would say my entire reading of the Beatitudes was to some degree dictated precisely by that experience from living over there. All three of the universities that I studied in Europe were both widely ecumenical, right? Meaning that people were coming from lots of different backgrounds, even Christian and non-Christian, let alone just different Christian backgrounds. There were even non-Christians who come to those universities to study the Bible. Like a lot of the non-Christians who study there, they think about the Bible like you and I might think about ancient Rome, and they study Jesus like they might study any other ancient figure. So for them, it's a historical exercise, but still an important one, right? I mean, they're giving over their academic lives to do it, so clearly they find it interesting, but not even all of them are believers. And then even from within the believing communities of people that attend those universities, all the ones that I was in Europe, broad range, not even just sort of, we think about the branches of Protestantism, but even Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. I mean, I studied with people from the widest possible range and quite closely and intimately. I mean, we spent time in study groups together and really talked about our own perspectives on the scriptures together, but also in terms of just geographical backgrounds. I mean, people from all over the world in all of those. I mean, there was one study group I was in during my doctorate in Ireland, where I was the only, I think I was one of only two Americans, and the other one was a female. So there was one male American, one female American, and then everybody else in that study group was from other places from around the world. We had students from 3 or 4 different African countries. We had students from China. We had a Malaysian student in that group. They were just from all over the place. And in Edinburgh, it was even probably more diverse than that.
Wow.
Even the Katholiek Universiteit Leuven, which is technically a Catholic university where I did my fellowship, was not just a bunch of Catholic students, although there were several. I mean, it was a very diverse group of people. All of that is to say that when we started talking about things like ethics, and of which the Beatitudes enters into that discussion in quite an intimate and important way, then a lot of our ethics in particular, both our theological ethics and the way we exegete particular passages from the Bible that have an ethical disposition, right, or sort of an ethical focus, is largely dictated by your own conditions, socioeconomic conditions, sociocultural conditions from the place from which you derive, right? So it's one thing to read Gutierrez on liberation theology, and it's another thing to study face-to-face with a student from a country where liberation theology is prominent, and then to find out from them why that's the case. That's just one of many examples, and I have all kinds of examples like that. So the Beatitudes in particular, my reading on it was really dictated by having one student maybe from one part of the world where things feel hopeless. So they read the Beatitudes as an eschatological hope. Like, oh, it's looking for the future. God's promising me some kind of great, glorious future, because things right now just are bad for me, and so I have to wait for the future. And then another student who it comes from a country that's really more about sort of making the right choices now, and they're focused on justice issues or whatever. So for them, it becomes more of an ethical reading than a future hope. And so trying to like walk through the thick weeds of all of that and sort of hack your way through it as much as you can to get to the root of what I think Jesus actually was trying to say. For me, my goal was always just what do I think Jesus meant, right? Yeah. That's always my goal. But it's impossible not to at least entertain the ideas that these other students brought to the table in those discussions, and that absolutely influenced the way, at least as a starting point when I approached the text, it influenced the willingness that I might have had to entertain ideas that I might not have entertained in the past, when I had only come from my own kind of corner of the planet and was limited in the scope of kind of the people I had interacted with and all of that. So, I mean, there's lots of examples of it. I won't point to maybe just one specific one, but my entire time of engaging with people around this text and many others was sort of dictated by listening and learning from people who come from places completely outside of my own experience. Yeah.
And I think we even have some of that too reflected here in our community at Calvin. Like we have students from, I think, 20 plus countries besides the United States. And I mean, what a gift they are in our classrooms and in discussion groups and even around the table, like PRS or at chapel, that you're hearing so many different interpretations of scripture and how are they understanding it. And I think given that we're training like future pastors and future ministry leaders, everyone's perspective is enriched by hearing that and thinking, how would I maybe preach this text to this audience or interpret this text in this paper? And I love that you had that experience and that we even have that experience here at Calvin. Mm-hmm. Going a little bit further into, I guess, reading with other people's perspectives in mind, but in the introduction, you go into some of the scholarship about how that first word of each beatitude is translated. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the English versions of the Bible have blessed as that translation. But throughout Ideal Disciples, you choose the word flourishing in your translation. Yeah. That was a pretty long section of your introduction. But just Cliff Notes version, what was your reason for picking that translation option?
Well, I had become convinced in my own research early on that blessed was the wrong word. But the trick then was finding the right one. So part of why I chose flourishing was based on my own research looking for a word quite like that one. And then part of it was that I stole it, although I do give credit in the book, obviously, to the person from whom I stole it. That the word flourishing as a proposal for what to use there comes from John. Well, at least the first time I read it came from Jonathan Pennington, mm-hmm. who's a professor of New Testament at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he wrote a helpful book back in, I think, 2017 on the Sermon on the Mount. It basically just a theological introduction to the whole sermon. And so he had a very short section on the Beatitudes in the beginning, and he moves on to the rest of the sermon, whereas mine's more focused just on the beatitudinal section. But I stole the proposal of that particular word from him. But the reason, so the Greek word there is makarios, or makarioi, the plural, and for it to be a blessing, or it would have to be opposed to curses. Blessings are opposed to curses in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And makarios is not opposed to curses, it's opposed to woes, which is something that's a little bit different because a curse and a woe is not the same thing. And in Luke, you find the Beatitudes and the woes next to each other in Luke 6. Matthew separates them mm-hmm. by almost the whole book, right? He puts his Beatitudes in Matthew 5, and the woes don't pop up until chapter 23, towards the end of the book. But thematically, they still go together, even though he separated them. And most people miss that. And I think mm-hmm. that's part of the problem, is most people miss that Matthew means for his Beatitudes and woes to still be read together, even though there are many, many chapters stuck in between them. So when you start to realize that macarisms, as they're called, go with woes and not curses, then you also have to realize that they're not actually technically blessings. Blessings imply almost a passivity to some degree, mm-hmm. but it does connotate something about the sort of the activity of pursuing something, not just receiving something. Although the Beatitudes also do imply that you do receive something. It's a both and, right? Yeah. Because we receive, for example, the kingdom of God. You don't go out and create or earn it. It's something that people receive. But to be poor in spirit is something you actively pursue in the process of moving towards the reception of that kingdom. It's both a pursuit and a reception of a blessing or a gift all at the same time. Yep. And so really just blessing by itself isn't enough. So, and I'm not the first to notice this problem. There have been lots of other scholars who have. R.T. France, in his great Matthew commentary like 30 years ago, proposed the word happy. Happy are those who mourn, which is an odd one, right? How can you be happy if you're mourning? But he explains it quite well what he means by that. But a lot of scholars, and myself included, still came along and said even that's not quite right, especially because it almost implies an emotional state, and that's not really what Jesus is getting at. So Pennington proposed flourishing, and I agreed with him on that, and I'm doubling down on his word, because it really is about going out and living a flourishing life according to the way in which Jesus calls people to live a flourishing life. So my translation reads, I did translate it myself after borrowing Pennington's word, so I don't know how close the rest of my translation is to his. I didn't check, but mine would be something like, flourishing are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It really is about becoming, and then of course the book has to dive into that. If being poor in spirit is about flourishing, poor in spirit sounds like maybe a quite negative thing if you don't dive into the meaning of the phrase. Or how can I flourish if I'm mourning? What is that all about? So I actually go through the whole book and try to define as carefully as I possibly can how mourning is a sense of flourishing, how being poor in spirit you can flourish while you're poor in spirit. And in fact, according to Jesus, I would say you have to be poor in spirit to flourish properly. And I try to unpack a lot of that, but that's the basis for kind of why I went in that direction is just a realization that the passivity implied by blessing, that you're just sitting around and waiting to receive something's not quite right. Jesus is calling his followers to go do something in the process of also being blessed by God.
Yeah. And I think that ties perfectly, at least in my mind, in your title, that these Beatitudes are, these are the character traits or the dispositions that mark what would be like an ideal disciple of Jesus Christ. Similar, like in that early part of your book, you talk about different interpretive options that you had. You mentioned, studying Beatitudes with folks from around the world. You have some that it's maybe more of an ethical interpretation. For some, it's more eschatological. How did you pick the route you went, given the breadth of options you had in interpreting these?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really was an exegetical decision, but it was also a narrative and literary one. So what I try to argue in this book and in my first one, I argue it in both quite a bit, is that Matthew is not meant to be read in sort of chunks in isolation from one another. It's meant to be read in a way where the whole thing is an ongoing developing narrative with several threads that are kind of branching off of that narrative, but still deeply connected to it. And so it's not enough even just to, when we think about context, it's not enough to look at one passage and look at only the surrounding context. The entire Gospel of Matthew is one massive meta context. And to some degree, you almost need to know how all of the threads are working together across the whole gospel to make sense of the individual portions of it. So in coming to my understanding of how the Beatitudes function in Matthew, it really was related to both the surrounding context immediately in the Sermon on the Mount and then the wider context from the beginning of it into the whole text. So, for example, Jesus has lots of conflicts with the scribes and Pharisees throughout the text. And that in and of itself has become a bit problematic in scholarship because Jesus had a lot of conflicts with the Pharisees, and others did too. The Pharisees are probably described in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not by name, but most scholars agree that they're being represented there. And those who were writing about them in the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't really seem to like them very much. And Josephus, in his writings, is quite critical of the Pharisees. But it's also the case that the Pharisees, after the fall of Jerusalem in 66 to 70 AD, were kind of the good guys in Judaism to a degree. They helped to, maintain the scriptures and to point a new way forward for those who had just lost their temple and all of that. So there is sort of a sense in which overemphasizing the supposed villainy of the Pharisees is actually quite problematic. But we can't underemphasize the fact that Jesus did still have quite a few very, very difficult confrontations with them, right? And he said some really harsh things to them in the process. And so he says to his disciples, he says something right after the Beatitudes. He said that essentially that their goal should be to have a righteousness that is greater than the scribes and Pharisees, right? And he's talking, the word righteousness there is not something that's imputed. He's talking about behavior. He's talking about going and living in a way where you are living out the principles and heart of God in a way that the Pharisees had failed to do it. That's what he has in mind. So if he's really talking about a comparison between his own disciples on the one hand and the scribes and Pharisees on the opposite end, then he is asking his disciples to go and be something and do something, even as they receive gifts from God. And it's not about earning. It's not about earning your way into the kingdom or anything like that. But there is still absolutely an emphasis on being the kind of person who is exhibiting the heart of God and displaying that for others. And that was at the root of his controversies with the Pharisees, that they were looking at him eating with sinners and saying, why are you doing that? Well, in Jesus' mind, and what he said to them was, well, this is the heart of God, right? He said to them 2 different times, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I'm supposed to spend my time with these people. And so that sent me on a path of realizing that the Beatitudes are just the beginning salvo in what is an ongoing way for Jesus to teach how his disciples should be juxtaposed to the behavior of those Pharisees. So if we're supposed to have greater righteousness than they exhibited, how? What does that mean? Well, to me, the Beatitudes are the starting point. It's the very first ethical teaching that he provides, which then helped me to realize that there was something ethical going on here and not only eschatological, that there are future blessings coming our way, but that he wants us to be and do things now in the present as we're moving in the direction of those future blessings. So even though there are some who read the Beatitudes as entirely eschatological, it's just about this future hope. And they even look at some of those things like poor in spirit as bad things that we're supposed to get rescued from. And I'm sympathetic to that view. But I also then started to look more closely at those phrases, realizing that there might be something ethical going on and finding out that, in fact, there are lots of evidences in the ancient world and different pieces of literature that I think would demonstrate that that those are things you're supposed to do and participate in, and not try to avoid, not hope to be rescued from. Poverty of spirit's an interesting one, right? The phrase to me, is, as I argue it in the book, is that it has to do with reliance upon God. So then it becomes quite a good thing, quite an ethical thing, to realize before God that you are in fact in poverty without him, but that you need him. And not just then to be rescued from that condition, but to dive deeper into it and to realize that you have to actually embrace this idea that you're completely in a state of spiritual poverty without him and reliant upon him, and therefore you're trusting in him in the path of becoming the kind of disciple he wants you to be. So that's why it's the first beatitude to me. It's the starting point of your sort of your posture before God begins right there, and then it becomes, in that reading, an ethical thing and not something to be avoided.
One of the things that you brought up, and I appreciated in your book, is your discussion on the Pharisees. Is so often they're painted in a very, negative villain light. And I think at one point you described it as, they had essentially left Israel as sheep without a shepherd. Yeah. And then for Jesus to come in and juxtapose it with, hey, this is how we are to live as followers of Jesus Christ, I thought was so interesting. And similarly, I think many of us who've been raised in the church often hear the Beatitudes taught is, you just have to receive. It's something you receive. It'll come eventually. Yeah. And no, this is actual character traits and dispositions that as followers of Christ we're to take on. And I personally, having read the book, found that very impactful. And I think that's something that going forward, it'll probably be something I come back to, just the chapter on being poor in spirit, or, what do we do when we're anticipating persecution? So I'm curious, spending so much time in the Beatitudes and writing a pretty significant chapter on each one, which one was maybe your favorite to research and to write about, and maybe was the most transformational for you as an author and someone studying the text?
That's a really good question, because I did have, I did them one at a time. And each one, when I got to each one, I'd finish one. There's almost a sense of mourning. Blessed are those who mourn, right?
Yep.
Or flourishing are those who mourn. There was a sense of mourning when I finished each section, thinking to myself, I'm almost disappointed to have to finish that section, wrap it up, and move on, because every single one of them was fruitful for me to spend time with and to dive into as deeply as I did. And then I'd move into the next one and I'd have to completely shift my thinking. I mean, they're all in the same set of Beatitudes, and yet they're all unique enough that you do there is a shift that takes place where you have to completely set aside your mental framework on one of them and recalibrate it for a whole new direction, for a whole new idea, because Jesus is packing so many different complex ideas into a very tight space. So there's a sense in which I had quite a unique and intimate experience with all of them. There is, I would say, two, though, maybe particular answers to that question. One would be Matthew 5:5, only because it was the one that launched the whole thing, because it was the one that I explored so deeply in the first book. Right? So flourishing are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And what it means to be meek is often misunderstood, and what it means to inherit the earth is misunderstood. So both halves of that one are usually deeply misunderstood in the literature. And like meekness, for example, you hear, and I'm probably going to step on some toes here, but you hear in preaching quite a bit, and I've heard this many times, that meekness is not weakness, it's power under control. And by the end of my work on that verse, I came to the realization that that's not true at all, even though I hear that preached as an idiom all the time. I don't think that that's the case. I don't think it's power under control. I think it's the lack of need to have power in the first place. It's not power under control. It's the surrender of the power. You pull it back a stage from that. Now, Jesus himself is described as meek in the book of Matthew, and of course he is power under control. But that doesn't mean that he means for us to think of it as a one-to-one correlation. Like for him, it's power under control, but that doesn't mean that he wants us to think of it that way, and I don't think that he does. I don't think it's power under control. Again, I think it's the absolute lack of need to have any power. So the idea that it's power under control to me is quite a Western one, because we are afraid of the idea maybe of surrendering the power that we think that we have. So it's like, oh, well, you're not supposed to surrender it. You're just supposed to control it properly. I really don't think. I mean, Jesus's audience at the time probably had virtually no power to speak of whatsoever. Yeah. So I don't think it's, again, go get power and then control it. I think it's don't even, that's not for you. The power that others have, that's not for you. Don't worry about that. And so there's a sense of meekness, which is really the embracing of a form of brokenness almost, being willing to enter into it quite deeply and therefore resonate with others who are in fact broken.
Yeah.
I think Bonhoeffer talked about it in quite that way. And I don't think Bonhoeffer was always the greatest exegete when it came to the Beatitudes. And yet he's one of my favorite writers to read on them, because when he got to the spiritual end of what he thought that they meant, whether he had exegeted them the way I would or not, it's irrelevant. Yeah. When he got to the spiritual end of what he thinks Jesus was trying to get at, I was always inspired by what he had to say. And of course, he's coming from the context of World War II and dealing quite deeply with being German in a German experiment that was moving away from his heart in such a passionate way. So I think that's the first answer, is just that diving into meekness as deeply as I did for both of these books, because I had to then revisit it. I couldn't just copy what I had done before. I had to look at it all over again.
Yeah.
That's the short answer. But I also think that the one on peacemaking in particular would be my kind of a 1B answer to that question, because what you typically find in lots of books on the Beatitudes is that people tend to paint all of Jesus's phrases with the widest possible brush, right? So when he says, blessed are those who mourn, or flourishing are those who mourn, then we just lump in every type of mourning we can think of. Well, Jesus must mean all of this. Or when we say, when he says flourishing are those who are merciful, well, what does it mean to have mercy? And then we just create these wide, broad definitions of mercy and just lump it all in. And I don't think Jesus is doing that. I think you actually can find definitions for the particular things he has in mind in the rest of the text of the Gospel of Matthew. Peacemaking is a word that's not found anywhere else in the New Testament. Peace is found all over the New Testament, but peacemaking isn't. It's just used one time by Jesus in that verse. So you have no choice but to face that puzzle and say, I don't have the rest of the whole New Testament, let alone the rest of Matthew, to necessarily define the word itself. But if you find forms of peacemaking in Matthew, I think that you could make a good case that that's the particular kind of thing Jesus is getting at. So pulling back this desire to want to paint the broadest possible brush to peacemaking and lump in peacemaking in times of war and talking about then the wars of the 20th century. And I mean, I don't want to go so far as to say that it's not relevant to all of that, because we should, of course, try to apply what Jesus said to our context. But I really don't think Jesus had a lot of these sort of broad brushstrokes in mind. I think he had quite particular things in mind, and in the book I try to expound upon what I think those are. And so that in particular was a very unique exercise for me of trying to narrow down the forms of peacemaking he's getting at. I mean, ultimately, I think loving your enemies is really what he had in mind, because he says it right afterwards, later in the same chapter. Which, there's a rabbi named Rabbi Held who just published a book 2 or 3 weeks ago where he talks about how loving, his book is, I think, called something like Judaism is About Love. That's the title of the book. And he's trying to dispel the idea that Judaism is this legalistic, harsh religion. And he's right. It's not. I mean, Judaism is about love. He's absolutely correct. But he's also correct, I think, in this very short section he has in the introduction of the book, where he says that there is a difference in the way in which Jewish people and Christians talk about love and think about love, and that the difference to him is the one command, love your enemies. Because Judaism doesn't have that and finds it impractical, right? At least that's his opinion. And so I think that's what Jesus is getting at with peacemaking, is more than anything else, talking about the love of enemies and mercy to those to whom and through whom they weren't going to receive mercy in their own Jewish context. Exactly, the issue with the Pharisees and those conflicts. That the people Jesus was accused of wrongdoing for associating with are the very people he came to make peace with. And I think that's kind of more what he's getting at. And diving into the very particulars of that was really fascinating for me.
I'm sure it was. I mean, as a reader, having that experience in the book, I had so many times where I was like, I can't imagine how much fun he had just doing the research on this. And your footnotes are very in-depth, so that'll also be a fun thing to return to. So maybe this is a question for another book, but you've highlighted a little bit, how do Matthew's Beatitudes kind of set the tone for the remainder of the gospel? And then how would they maybe connect to the Great Commission at the very end? Yeah, it's another great question, because I'm very, very convinced now, after 2 books on Matthew and lots of other study on Matthew. I mean, I try to read widely on the whole Bible, especially the New Testament. As a New Testament scholar, I try to read a lot on Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, because I just enjoy it, and Second Temple literature. But if I had to pick a single book, of course, that I've read the most on, it's this one. It's Matthew, and it still remains, I think, a big passion of mine. I mean, the next book actually I'm writing is on Paul, but and I'm just more convinced than ever that Matthew is meant to be read in this sort of literary and narratival sense, that it's a narrative that the writer has constructed quite carefully, and that you really have to really understand something quite deep about the entire whole of the text in order to understand its smaller parts.
So I say all that to answer your question because I really do think that something as early as Matthew 5 has a deep influence on Matthew 28, even though most people might not catch it or read it that way. Here's the most important way I would connect it, although I think it connects in quite a few ways. There is this debate in Matthew 21 where Jesus is talking to, again, some of the Jewish leaders. Mm-hmm. And there's this parable that's being told. And some of the Jewish leaders, in the parable, there are these people, these leaders who they kill God's servant who is sent to them to collect on the rent, right?
Yep.
And then God says in the form of the landowner, well, I'll send my son. They won't harm my son. But then the son shows up and they kill him too.
Yep.
And then the result of that is that they're told that the land is going to be stripped away from them. They're going to lose rights to the land, and it's going to be given to someone else. There's a debate about exactly what that means. In earlier scholarship, which is still around, less prevalent but still around, the idea was that maybe the Jews were losing the land and it was being handed to the church or the Gentiles. I reject that view of that passage. I don't think that's what's going on. I just think that what God's saying is that it's being taken away from the leaders who were particularly leading it at the time and being handed over to a different set of leadership, different set of leaders. But it's not, Jews are losing it and it's being given to someone else. It's that the Jewish leaders are losing it and other Jewish leaders are being handed the reins.
Yep.
And the church then and Gentiles get included into that in the Gospel of Matthew by the end of the story.
Yep.
But that's really what's going on. And I think that's why two chapters earlier in Matthew 19, Jesus says to his disciples, in the renewal of all things, you will have 12 seats that you will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. He's sort of pronouncing leadership upon them, that his disciples are going to take the reins of leadership away from the current leaders who are failing. And this is quite important, by the way, because it avoids supersessionist readings of the book that become anti-Jewish, right? Mm-hmm. Like a lot of the ideas that the Jews are losing out and being replaced has led to a lot of anti-Semitic readings of the text, and I think that's a mistake. So this helps to avoid that in a lot of ways, but I think it's a better reading of the text anyway. It's not. I didn't come to that reading conditioned by this desire to avoid anti-Semitism. I'm just very happy that my reading happens to also do that, and that's not unique to me either. There are other scholars in the last 10 years in particular who have argued in favor of the idea that it's just the leadership that's kind of being swapped out. One thing that I have done that I do think is a bit more unique to my own reading in particular, even among those readings, though, is that I name which leaders are getting sort of the charge of the place, which is that's what Jesus is doing by raising up disciples, is he's raising the leaders of the future kingdom, those who will lead at the renewal of all things. Now, all of that's relevant to your question because when you get to Matthew 28 and they're all sent out, right?
Yep.
And it harkens back to Matthew 10. In Matthew 10, he sends out his disciples on mission to go and love and to preach the kingdom. But in Matthew 10, he says, only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's not until the end in Matthew 28 where he then extends the mission past the house of Israel to the ends of the earth.
Yep.
And Jesus is, of course, his commission to them is, I have authority and I'll be with you always and you're not on your own here. So the reason why I think this is so important in the connection between the two is that Matthew 5, in my view, in the Beatitudes, that Jesus is starting the initial stage of creating the kinds of disciples who will be able to lead well when they take the reins of leadership from those who have failed. So the leaders that Jesus is in conflict with have failed in their leadership. They need to be replaced. Jesus' disciples are the ones that are going to replace them, but they have to be ready and prepared to do that. And the ethical dispositions of the Beatitudes are the most important initial things that they need to become, right? To develop within themselves so that they can lead properly, because you can't get to Matthew 28. And it's not that they're like perfect followers by Matthew 28, because they aren't, right? It's just shortly before that we have Peter denying Jesus, right? So they are still making a lot of mistakes, and that's fine because we all do. But the idea still is, though, that they have been developed through the Beatitudes as ethical dispositions to become the kinds of people that Jesus can send out and sort of trust with the mission to say, you have poverty of spirit, you are meek, you're willing to mourn over the brokenness of the world as you go out and minister to those people, that there are these things that he needed them to become so that he could send them out, which I think that extends to all disciples for all time.
Yeah. Your book is so well suited, I think, both to the very highly academic readers, so your kind of colleagues, if you will, but also to pastors and to students, and actually students in your own Matthew class this coming semester will get to read it. Yeah. So given such a broad audience, what message or theme do you hope that these readers will take away from Ideal Disciples?
I think it really piggybacks off of everything I just said in your last question, that to me it really is about this sort of this dispositional nature, sort of a slight spoiler, but I promise that I'm not giving you the whole thing here. If you do go read it, this will get unpacked, hopefully in a very helpful way. But really what I'm trying to do is this, and this is what I hope readers will take away from it. Students, pastors, scholars, anybody who reads it, I think all hopefully can benefit from this to some degree. That if you think about what a disposition is, it's different than a decision, right? An ethical decision is a decision you have to make to do X, Y, Z. Yeah. You're faced with two problems, or a problem with two solutions or three solutions, and you have to walk one road and reject the others, and that's just the nature of life.
Yep.
But ethical decisions, choosing one thing over another, is separate from a disposition. A disposition is the kind of ethical character trait that helps you to be the kind of person that can make those decisions and make them well.
Yep.
So for me, a lot of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is all about decision making. If you're faced with this or that, this is what you do. This is how you handle things like divorce or prayer or avoiding hypocrisy or all these things. But to execute the ethical processes that are described not just in the Sermon on the Mount, but all through the entire rest of the Gospel of Matthew, my view is that tiny little section of Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, in just those few verses, is unpacking for you the kind of person you have to become to do all of that well. And an analogy I've used for this, and it's in the book, is that I have a coffee mug here in front of me with John Calvin's face on it, and that's an accident. I didn't bring it here because I teach at Calvin Seminary. I just happened to have bought this coffee mug at Calvin's church, and it was sitting in my office, and I'm drinking out of it right now. So happy accident that his face is on there. Anyway, so if I were to pick up this coffee mug and I were to smack it with a hammer and it shattered, the coffee mug is brittle, but it didn't break because it's brittle. It broke because I enacted upon it with some kind of force. Yeah. And in fact, despite its brittleness, it's actually designed to do the opposite, right? You hold hot liquid in it. You don't want it to break. It's not supposed to break. It's supposed to be sturdy enough to not leak hot liquid all over you. So its brittleness is a disposition that predicts what will happen if I smack it with a hammer, but it's not the thing that causes it to break. The hammer did.
Yep.
To me, that's what the Beatitudes are, as dispositions. They are the things that predict how you will behave when certain conditions are met. So if persecution hits, how are you going to handle persecution? If you develop the Beatitudes in your life, that predicts how you're going to behave when persecution comes your way. If you're sent out by God on some bizarre mission that you didn't know you were going to get sent on, and maybe it's difficult and it's an arduous journey and all kinds of crazy stuff comes your way. And that's the journey I went on when I did 10 years in Europe. It wasn't difficult in the sense that I was traveling around Europe and enjoying myself. Yeah. But it was very hard to move my family to several new countries and new cultures and adapt to those cultures. And I think developing dispositions like the Beatitudes within my family helped us to be able to respond well to all of the challenges that we faced as we went through the process. Yeah. So to me, that's the value of the Beatitude, and I think that value holds for anybody that reads the book, hopefully, and the Beatitudes themselves, is that if you understand it the way that I do, my hope is that you will develop these things as dispositions that can then serve you in the way in which you respond to situations and face decisions throughout life. And I think it will make all of us better, more prepared decision makers, essentially, for the sake of the kingdom and for just any aspect of our personal lives along the way.
For sure. So final question for you, but you've got 2 books published with Baylor Press. What's next?
So I'm working on another book right now that's probably about 2/3 finished, although I have all kinds of ruminations in my mind about making some adjustments and changes. But even if I make them, I still think I'm about 2/3 of the way done. And this is the first one I'm doing on Paul, and I'll probably always go back and forth between Matthew and Paul, or even Gospels more widely in Paul. I mean, I'd like to write maybe at some point on things like Mark and Luke as well, but the book on Paul is about kinship language, because Paul, he uses kinship language. My view and what I'm trying to argue is that he does it to create social cohesion among people who typically wouldn't experience social cohesion, right? So in Romans, for example, people often think about Romans as this soteriological letter, and it is to a degree, but by soteriological, I mean that it's sort of describing the nature and process of salvation. Yeah. And while that's there, I don't think that that's actually the main point. I think it's more what we would say is ecclesiological, which means creating a people for God. Mm-hmm. I think that's more what Romans is getting at, is creating a people for God. And the soteriological or salvation aspects of the letter are used rhetorically to help them understand their place before God and place before one another, so that they can then see we're all in this together. But the ecclesiological value, I think, is the more important part. And I get that from the end of the letter, right? When the table fellowship, when he's got people at table fellowship who aren't getting along, he's trying to get them to get along.
Yep.
They're supposed to look back at the whole rest of his letter and say, here are all the reasons why you should be getting along. But the getting along, I think, is really what he's trying to drive at. And I think that the kinship language in Romans is one of the ways he's doing that. You know, you all have one Father, so you're in the same boat.
Yep.
You all have one big brother, Jesus. You're in the same boat. You're all brothers and sisters of one another, whether you're Jew or Gentile, slave or free, doesn't matter. You're all in the same boat. So I'm trying to talk about kinship language from the very particular aspect of how Paul uses it to build relationship, reconciliation, and cohesion among the people in these churches. And I'm dealing mostly with Romans, a little bit with Galatians, and a little bit in one section with 1 Corinthians. But that's what I'm working on. That's the goal, is to try to use that language as a unifying force. One interesting aspect of this that I'm trying to develop is that this idea that Paul's doing it because as a diaspora, a member of the Jewish diaspora in particular, that he would have experienced something quite similar, being spread out in the diaspora. You know, you have this mixture of these people with Greek backgrounds, Roman backgrounds, Jewish backgrounds that are all living in these places together. And as some of them are coming to know God through Christ, they have to figure out, how do we take all of our own backgrounds, our own scruples, our own ways of understanding what's right and wrong, pure and impure, and how do we filter that into a way where we can kind of see things through God's lens and build fellowship. And thinking about everybody as a family, I think, is Paul's main way of accomplishing that. So yeah, that's what I'm working on, and it's been a lot of fun. I don't know exactly when that'll be done, maybe by the end of this year, I think. But hopefully it'll also make its way out into the world, and maybe we can have one of these conversations about that one.
I was just going to say, we'll look forward to having you back in about a year when that's published.
Yeah. Hopefully that'll be the right timeline for that.
Hopefully. So where can people buy Ideal Disciples?
Well, since it's published through a major academic publisher, it's available online pretty much anywhere. You can get it through the publisher itself, Baylor University Press. By the way, just a shout out to them. The reason I did book 2 with them is because book 1 was such a great experience, and book 2 was just as good of an experience.
That's wonderful.
With them. I love the team there. Cade Jarrell is the acquisitions editor that I've been working with, but everybody else there that I've worked with as well, and I've worked with people in production and cover design, and they've all been fantastic. So shout out to them. But so you can get it on their website, Baylor University Press, but it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's website. In physical stores, I'm pretty sure that the Baker Academic was a different publisher. They have a bookstore, the Baker Bookhouse, and I'm pretty sure they said that they were going to carry some copies, at least locally here, for our students. But in terms of like brick and mortar stores, I don't know exactly how many it'll end up in, but online it's available virtually everywhere.
All right.
Even like random bookseller websites that I never heard of, I found out are selling it. So yeah, you can find it pretty much anywhere.
All right. So that gives no excuse to our listeners then.
Yeah.
Or our viewers. Get a copy. Well, Thank you for sitting down and talking to me a little bit about Ideal Disciples.
Absolutely.
I personally love reading it, and I'm sure it will be a gift to both the professors and the students and the pastors that read it as well. So Thank you so much, and congrats.
Yeah, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.